Hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about imagery. Now, when we think about imagery, the first thing that comes to mind is sight. But that's just one aspect of imagery, as you'll see today. So, imagery at its core is basically descriptive language that appeals to the senses. That's what imagery would refer to, right? That's the simplest way it can be put. We use language that is so descriptive that it appeals to our senses. In other words, we are able to imagine what is being described through our senses. Okay? So when it comes to imagery, you must pay attention to the words used because the words will appeal to our senses. That is how you identify the type of imagery. Okay? So why do we use imagery? So we use imagery to create realism, to bring things to life. Okay? To make situations or scenarios seem more realistic. So this is why we employ imagery, because we want to create realism. Okay? So there are 5 types of imagery because I told you previously that it appeals to our senses, and as you know we have 5 senses. So visual imagery would be sight. Olfactory imagery would be smell. Auditory imagery would be hearing. Gustatory imagery will be taste, and tactile imagery will be touch. Now, if you did not know these particular terms, these would be the terms that are used to describe the appeal, okay, or the sense, okay? But if you were given an exam and you were to write gustatory, or you were to write taste instead of gustatory, it would still be correct because it is taste, right? But we can just say that gustatory is a more fancy term, or yeah, a fancier term. But more fancy, fancier. Let's just say more polished. Yes, more polished. That's a better way of putting it. More polished term. All right. So we are going to start with visual imagery. Visual imagery appeals to the eyes through description of color, light, size, or pattern. So if you look at these elements, you would realize that these are elements that we can visualize. So anytime there's description of color, you know that that is an appeal to our sight because we can see color. Okay? Whiteboard. This is no, I'm using another example. Blue shirt. That is something we can visualize because we have a color. Okay? If I say a very big house, we can also visualize that because we have an idea of the size of the house. All right? So any details that allow us to visualize visualize the object or the scene, that would be an appeal to our sight, and thus that would be an example of visual imagery. So let's look at the example. She asks us to imagine a gray cat wearing a bow tie and a top hat. Okay, so we have color in a gray cat. Okay, then we have a description of the clothes, right? So a bow tie and a top hat. So we can imagine what this would, we could imagine, or we could visualize this image. It would be very funny, of course, but yeah. A gray cat wearing a bow tie and a top hat. All right? So any description of color, light, size, pattern, any element that allows us to visualize the image would be an appeal to visual imagery. Okay? Olfactory imagery. This appeals to the sense of smell through description of fragrance or odor, right? So if we can smell it, right, based on the description, then we have an appeal to our sense of smell, which as we know is called olfactory imagery. So for example, hospitals always made her feel uncomfortable. The sterile smell of the waiting room mixed with the pungent aroma of cheap coffee evoked feelings of sadness. Okay, so we have sterile. Sterile means that a place is clean, it doesn't have germs or bacteria. So when we think of sterile, we can think about the cleaning agents that will be used to sanitize the place, right? That's what we would think about when we see the word sterile, right? Mixed with the pungent aroma. So pungent means that the smell is extremely strong, often unpleasant, right? Cheap coffee, and we all know what coffee smells like, or should. Evoked feelings of sadness. So we have descriptions that appeal to our sense of smell. So if a person were to read this, that person would have an idea of what the hospital smelled like. Okay? All right. So continuing, auditory imagery. This appeals to the sense of hearing by describing noises. Okay? So a noise of broken glass created an eerie feeling inside me. Eerie means scary, right? So noise of broken glass. If a glass were to break, we would know what that sounds like. It is going to be a loud sound that is going to startle us because of the noise that it would make. Hence, the sentence said, created an eerie feeling. So that the noise of broken glass made the person feel frightened. Okay? So we could imagine what that would sound like. Silence is also an appeal to sound because we know what silence sounds like, right? You hear nothing. All right? So that would be auditory imagery. Gustatory imagery appeals to the sense of taste by describing whether a food item is sweet, salty, savory, or spicy. So once we have an appeal to taste, we have an example of gustatory imagery. Okay? For example, George took an orange slice, but to his surprise, it left a bitter lemon taste in his mouth. Okay, so we have bitter. We know what bitter tastes like, right? Lemon taste. So this is all an appeal to our sense of taste, because we could imagine what the orange slice, we can imagine what the orange slice would taste like, right? So this is an appeal to our sense of taste. All right, so these are four types of imagery, and we'll conclude with tactile imagery. Okay, so we move on to the final type of imagery, which is going to be tactile imagery. So tactile imagery appeals to the sense of touch by describing how something feels, such as temperature or texture. So if something feels hot, cold, if the texture feels rough, right. Those would all be appeals to our sense of touch. So for example, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and realized that his skin was just so cold, right? So if I touch my skin and it feels cold, that is an appeal to tactile imagery, because cold is a temperature, okay? And we all know what cold feels like, okay? So yes, this gives us an idea of how his skin felt. So therefore is an appeal to touch. Okay? So I hope that you were able to understand this literary device. At its core, it simply involves the use of descriptive language so that the readers can imagine what is happening using their senses. Okay? So you have to pay very close attention to the words used, because the words used or the language used will tell us which sense is being appealed to. Okay? So thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next one.